11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
Apollo 13 was the seventh manned mission in the Apollo space program and third lunar landing attempt. The Apollo space program was created by NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, during the Cold War. NASA was created by the American government and officially put into action when Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act on July 29, 1956. This action was especially rushed since the Soviet Union launched the satellite Sputnik 1 into orbit on October 4, 1957. The launch of Sputnik 1 commenced the space race, a widely known competition in the 20th century between the Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, for supremacy in spaceflight capability. The space race focused on satellites until the new American president, John F. Kennedy, directed the race to the moon in a speech on September 12, 1962.
Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
Apollo 11 sent the first humans to the moon on July 20, 1969, soon followed by Apollo 12 on November 19, 1969. Apollo 13 would be the next to the moon. The Apollo 13 crew was a well-trained group with a commander who had been a part of several other NASA flights previously to Apollo 13. Fred W. Hayes Jr. was the lunar module pilot. John L. Swigert Jr. was the command module pilot. James A. Lovell Jr. was the commander. Many superstitious parties were nervous about NASA not skipping the number 13 in the Apollo missions, but NASA flaunted the fact that they were not superstitious by scheduling takeoff at 13:13 military time on April 11, 1970. The launch itself went according to plan. Shortly afterwards, though, the center engine of the second stage cut off more than 2 minutes early. In order to compensate, controllers burned the other 4 engines an additional 34 seconds. Also, the third stage engine was fired for an extra 9 seconds during its orbital insertion burn. Fortunately, this all resulted in a mere 1.2 feet per second greater speed than planned, so the first few problems were overlooked, and the astronauts filmed a live broadcast of their so far successful mission.
My companions and I said, every flight has a crisis. Something always goes wrong. This happened early in the flight, and we're now free and clear of any other things going on.
The broadcast finished at 55 hours and 46 minutes. Shortly after the broadcast was over, Mission Control told the astronauts to do some housekeeping and stir the liquid oxygen tanks, their only source of oxygen, which is a routine job. Although this time, something went terribly wrong.
Just flip the switch?
Rarely flip the switch.
They were about 200,000 miles from Earth when Jack Swigert flipped the switch. The date, by the way, was April 13th.
We'd like it to stir up your cryo tank. Stand by.
Seconds later, the men of Apollo 13 were fighting for their lives.
At 55 hours and 55 minutes on April 13, 1970, the circuits in the oxygen tanks sparked, causing an entire tank to explode. The crew knew that disaster had hit, and so did Mission Control, after Lovell said the 5 most famous words in spaceflight history.
Control.
We had a problem here.
This explosion caused tank number 1 to explode, in addition to tank number 2. The first tank was completely empty, and the second tank was depleting fast. The astronauts' only source of oxygen was gone in mere minutes, and the leaking oxygen was causing the ship to drift off course. Warning signs were going off throughout both the Odyssey, the command module, and the Aquarius, the lunar module, indicating the loss of 3 fuel cells out of 4, and if the oxygen ran out, the 4th would soon deplete. At 1 hour and 29 seconds after the explosion, Flight Director Glenn Looney, back at Mission Control, directed the Apollo 13 crew to use the lunar module Aquarius as a lifeboat. This had never happened before in the history of space exploration. The problem was, the lunar module was designed to support 2 people for 2 days, but it would have to support 3 people for 5 days. Landing on the moon was not possible at this point, and the crew had to come back to Earth as soon as possible. But the problem was, they were over 200,000 miles away from Earth, and very close to the moon. Lovell, Hayes, Swigert, and Mission Control came up with 2 plans to get home, each with their own risks. Plan A would involve turning around, away from the moon, and reaching home in 2 days, but if the crew steered 1 degree off, they could crash into the moon, and part of the module to be used was dangerously close to the exploded part of the command module Odyssey. The other plan would be to go around the moon in 5 days, which would be spent in the lunar module, but it was the safest route, so it had to be taken. Soon, the disposal of carbon dioxide became a major issue, and there were not enough filters in the lunar module. The crew had to take their first trip back into the Odyssey in over 12 hours to retrieve the extra CO2 filters. The Apollo 13 mission had already broken records for the most problems on a space mission, but they would only add up, considering that the backup filters were square and the openings in the lunar module were circle. The crew was not going to give up. Using duct tape, plastic bags, and cardboard, Mission Control played out the situation and instructed Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert through the process. The problem was also overcome, and the CO2 levels began to decrease. The oxygen tank of the lunar module would suffice for the rest of the journey. So, finally, the oxygen problem disappeared. At 151 hours until re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, and only 28.2 pounds of water left, the astronauts had to start rationing out their food and water supply, but all the resources would run out 5 hours prior to their return to Earth. Due to these circumstances, the crew lost a total of 31.5 pounds on their journey, over 50% more than any other crew in space. Food and water was rationed and carbon dioxide levels were balanced, the crew had to enter their new route around the moon into the lunar module's computers. Since no other stars could be spotted due to the pollution of gases, the sun could be the only reference point of the route. Trajectory had to be computed, but the computers did not have the ability to figure it out.
Way.
So when people look at their BlackBerry today or their iPhone, they're holding something in their hand that has far more computing capabilities than the spacecraft you were flying in outer space with.
Oh, yes. Jack Swigert called me all the numbers, and I wrote them down, and then we had a conversion table for the lunar module, and I did the arithmetic to get the new numbers, and then I called Mission Control. I said, would you check my arithmetic for me, please, to make sure I'm not making a
You're
mistake?
afraid to make a mistake here.
Well,
a mistake will cost you your life.
Soon, the route was put into the computer, and Apollo 13 was on its way back home. At 73 hours and 46 minutes, the astronauts and Houston's conversations proved that everybody calmed down a little bit more, but tension was still high. 4 hours before entering Earth's atmosphere, the astronauts detached the service module, and 2 hours prior to splashdown, the command module was miraculously revised.
There they are.
There they are. They've made it.
All 3 shoots out. Listen to the crowd on the boat.
Yeah, in the mains, it really looks great.
An extremely loud applause here in Mission Control.
Look at the heat scarring on the side of that module.
Finally, the Apollo 13 command module, carrying its crew of Fred W. Hayes Jr., John L. Swigert Jr., and James A. Lovell Jr., splashed down in the South Pacific on April 17th at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time, 142 hours and 55 minutes after launch. The shuttle landed within sight of the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima, and the crew was aboard and safe within 45 minutes. Apollo 13 would make headlines all over the world, and the crew, as well as Mission Control, would receive worldwide recognition for their successful disaster.